In the sweltering streets of Berlin during the summer of 1923, the air hung heavy with the acrid smell of fresh ink and human sweat, as ordinary citizens pushed wheelbarrows overflowing with banknotes that had become little more than kindling for the desperate. A mother clutched a single loaf of bread to her chest, while her husband counted out millions of marks at the counter, prices having doubled in the hour since he left home. Children played among scattered piles of worthless paper, their laughter hollow against the constant clatter of printing presses that never slept. This was not war. This was something quieter and more insidious. The moment when money itself died, and with it, the trust that once bound a society together. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly in the shadows of a peace treaty signed 4 years earlier, a document that demanded gold the nation no longer possessed. Yet even as the first tremors rippled through the economy, few could imagine how completely the familiar world would dissolve. The Great War had ended in exhaustion and defeat, leaving the German people stunned by the sudden silence of the guns and the weight of an empire that had crumbled overnight. The Kaiser had fled, the old order lay in ruins, and in its place rose the fragile Weimar Republic, a democracy born under the harshest terms ever imposed on a defeated power. Reparations stretched into the billions of marks, territories were stripped away, factories stood idle, and the once proud industrial heart of Europe beat faintly under the burden of impossible debts. But the true rupture was still invisible, hidden beneath the surface of daily routines that continued as if the old rules still applied. The years immediately after the armistice still carried echoes of a life that felt almost normal for those who remembered the pre-war prosperity. Families gathered around sturdy wooden tables for meals of bread, sausage, and potatoes, the rhythm of work in the factories and offices providing a fragile sense of continuity. Children walked to school with satchels on their backs, while shopkeepers arranged goods on shelves, confident that the mark in their tills would hold its value until the next morning. Cafes buzzed with conversation about politics and art, the theaters filled with audiences eager for distraction, and the streets of Berlin hummed with the clop of horses and the occasional motor car. Savings accounts in local banks represented security for the middle class, a lifetime of careful planning that promised dignity in old age. Farmers in the countryside tended fields that had fed the nation through the war years, believing that the land itself would remain a constant, even if governments changed. This was the daily rhythm before the invisible forces gathered strength, a time when the price of a newspaper stayed the same for weeks, and a worker's weekly wage could still purchase real nourishment and small comforts. No one spoke of collapse, because the concept itself seemed distant, a warning from history books, rather than a threat to the present. The Republic's leaders spoke of recovery and reform, while the people clung to the routines that had defined their existence for generations. Yet beneath the surface, the first cracks were already forming, the kind that no headline could capture until it was far too late. The warning signs arrived so gradually they were mistaken for temporary inconveniences, rather than the opening movements of catastrophe. Inflation began its slow climb after the first reparations payments in 1921, when the government turned to the printing presses to bridge the gap between income and obligation. Prices edged upward month by month, a loaf of bread costing a few more marks each week, but still within reach for most families. Factories produced goods that sold for sums that seemed impressive on paper, yet bought less and less in reality. Bankers adjusted interest rates with cautious optimism, while politicians debated budgets in smoke-filled chambers, convinced that time and negotiation would restore balance. The mark lost value against foreign currencies, but the change felt manageable, a nuisance rather than a mortal wound. People adjusted their habits, tightening belts and skipping small luxuries, believing the storm would pass, as it had after previous crises. No one understood what was coming next, because the numbers still made sense on a human scale. The daily wage still covered essentials, and savings still represented future security, even if they bought slightly less each month. The press carried stories of economic strain but framed them as challenges to be overcome, rather than the first tremors of systemic failure. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late for the quiet adjustments that had once kept society stable. Tension rose sharply in January 1923, when French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr industrial region to enforce reparations payments the government could no longer meet. Factories fell silent under foreign control, and workers walked out in a campaign of passive resistance, that the state supported with printed money. The printing presses accelerated their relentless output, flooding the economy with banknotes that chased ever fewer goods. Prices began their exponential climb, doubling and then tripling within weeks rather than months. Wages were paid twice a day so workers could rush to stores before the afternoon devaluation rendered their earnings useless. The streets filled with a new urgency, people carrying satchels and carts, loaded with currency that grew heavier by the hour, yet lighter in real value. Shopkeepers changed prices hourly, chalkboards outside stores rewritten with frantic haste. The government printed larger denominations to keep pace, but the numbers on the notes could never catch the speed of the collapse. Uncertainty spread like a fog through every conversation, every transaction, every plan for the future. Families who had once planned vacations or home improvements now focused solely on surviving until the next payday. The rhythm of ordinary life fractured under the pressure, and the invisible hand of inflation tightened its grip on the nation's throat. Key decisions made in the corridors of power accelerated the spiral beyond any hope of control. Faced with the occupation and the need to support striking workers, the government chose to finance the resistance by issuing ever more currency rather than negotiating compromise or cutting expenditure. The Reichsbank operated around the clock, its machines churning out notes in denominations that escalated from thousands to millions and then billions of marks. Economists warned of the danger, but political necessity overrode caution. The fear of appearing weak before the victors outweighed the risk of domestic ruin. Industrialists hoarded foreign currency, while ordinary citizens watched their life savings evaporate in real time. The mark's value against the dollar fell from thousands to millions within months, and still the presses rolled. International lenders grew wary, refusing further credit as the German economy became a black hole of paper money. Each new policy intended to stabilize only deepened the crisis, because the fundamental imbalance between printed currency and actual production had already passed the point of no return. The decisions that seemed pragmatic at the time proved catastrophic in hindsight, yet at the moment they were made, they appeared as the only path available to a nation backed into a corner. The system began to fail openly in the late summer of 1923, when the numbers themselves became surreal, and everyday transactions turned into exercises in absurdity. A single US dollar equated to over 4 trillion marks by November, and the price of basic goods changed so rapidly that merchants abandoned price tags entirely, preferring to barter or accept foreign currency. Printing presses could not keep up with demand for larger notes, and workers received their pay in suitcases stuffed with bundles that required counting by weight rather than number. The clatter of those machines became the soundtrack of a dying economy, a constant mechanical roar that filled factories and government buildings alike. Stores emptied as soon as goods arrived, because no one trusted the mark to hold value for even an hour. Restaurants posted new menus every morning and adjusted them again by afternoon. The silence that followed each announcement of another devaluation was heavier than any shout. By this point, the collapse had moved beyond economics into the realm of lived experience, where the very concept of value had been severed from reality. Human consequences unfolded with brutal clarity as the middle class watched decades of thrift and labor dissolve into nothing. Pensioners who had saved for retirement found their fixed incomes worthless overnight, forcing them to sell family heirlooms or beg in the streets. Workers who once supported households on steady wages now rushed home with bundles of cash, only to discover it bought less than the previous day's earnings. Children went to bed hungry despite parents working longer hours because food prices outpaced every paycheck. Prostitution surged in major cities as women and even teenagers traded dignity for a meal or a handful of coal to heat their homes. Crime rates climbed as desperation replaced morality, and the black market became the only reliable source of necessities. The smell of desperation mixed with the scent of wood smoke from those burning worthless banknotes to stay warm on cold nights. Families that had once shared laughter around dinner tables now sat in tense silence, wondering how they would survive the next week. The social contract that had promised reward for hard work and prudence lay shattered, leaving millions adrift in a world where effort no longer guaranteed survival. Social breakdown accelerated as trust evaporated, and the bonds that held communities together frayed beyond repair. Riots erupted in cities when bread prices doubled between sunrise and sunset, and crowds stormed bakeries only to find shelves stripped bare. Political violence intensified as extremist groups from both left and right exploited the chaos, promising simple solutions to an enraged populace. The middle class that had formed the backbone of stability found itself pauperized and radicalized, its savings gone, its future erased. Universities closed temporarily as students and professors alike struggled to afford basic sustenance. Hospitals turned away patients because fees could not be calculated in time to match the falling currency. The once orderly streets of Berlin echoed with arguments and accusations as neighbors turned on one another over the slightest perceived advantage in the daily scramble for resources. Fear replaced hope in the eyes of ordinary people, and the laughter that had once filled public spaces gave way to a grim silence broken only by the rustle of endless paper money. The collapse had moved from the balance sheets into the hearts and homes of millions, leaving scars that would not heal for generations. The long-term historical impact of this hyperinflation extended far beyond the economic statistics and reshaped the political landscape of Europe for decades to come. When the new Rentenmark was introduced in November 1923, backed by mortgages on land and industry, the immediate spiral halted, but the damage had already been done. A generation watched its life savings vanish in months, fostering a deep distrust of democratic institutions and paper currency alike. The political center collapsed as voters turned toward parties that offered radical change and scapegoats for the suffering. The Weimar Republic survived in name, but its legitimacy was permanently wounded by the memory of those wheelbarrows and worthless notes. The economic ruin created fertile ground for extremism and the promise of strong leadership that would never allow such humiliation again. International observers noted the fragility of the new order, but few grasped how completely the social fabric had been torn. The lessons of Weimar would echo through the 20th century, reminding the world that financial collapse could destroy more than wealth, it could dismantle the very foundations of civilized society. Even after the currency reform, the ghosts of hyperinflation lingered in the collective memory, shaping attitudes toward money, government, and stability for the rest of the century. Families who had lost everything taught their children to distrust banks and to value tangible assets over promises on paper. Politicians who lived through the crisis carried the trauma into future decisions, often swinging between excessive caution and reckless experimentation. The social destruction proved irreversible for many. The middle class never fully recovered its former confidence and its place in the national order. The rupture had exposed how quickly prosperity could turn to ruin when the mechanisms of trust and value failed. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt, but the memory of those summer days in 1923 remained a cautionary tale embedded in the national psyche. The world watched and studied the events, hoping to avoid similar fates, yet the underlying vulnerabilities of modern economies persisted. Hyperinflation had demonstrated with terrifying clarity that the collapse of money could unravel the threads of civilization itself, leaving behind a landscape of broken dreams and heightened dangers. The echoes of that Weimar summer continue to haunt any society that underestimates the fragility of its economic foundations. What began as a response to wartime debts and political pressure ended as a profound warning about the speed with which order can dissolve into chaos. The people who pushed those wheelbarrows through the streets of Berlin carried more than paper. They carried the shattered remnants of an entire way of life. Their stories remind us that collapses do not always arrive with dramatic announcements or sudden violence. Sometimes they creep forward through the quiet erosion of daily certainty until the moment when recognition comes too late. The hyperinflation of 1923 did not merely destroy savings. It destroyed faith in the future and in the institutions meant to protect it. In the end, the true cost was measured not in trillions of marks, but in the human lives forever altered by the experience of watching value disappear before their eyes. The collapse had run its course, but its lessons remained etched into history, a silent sentinel against the next moment when invisible pressures begin to mount once more.